Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today we are taking a look at the best tier 2 combat characters natively for this class. We are not going to be talking about characters with uniforms, but uniforms do play a big part in the character ranking list that I'm going to give you, so please take note of when I mention that a character becomes much better with a uniform, because it does catapult some characters from the situationally useful up into the strongly recommended category. So let's jump into it, guys. Let's start with my favorite character, Hulkling. Now, judging by his stats here, and as you can see, World Boss, Shadowlands, Alliance Battle, and PvP, Hulkling is absolute trash. He's basically useless everywhere, and his tier 2 doesn't do anything to help him. Yeah, 25% chance when he's hit. As we know, when hitting is much worse than when you're attacking. 20-second cooldown, just awful. This is, I'm tempted to say this is trash level, but I'm just going to leave you with irrelevant. Moving on next to Crossbones. Crossbones is a character that a lot of people like as a villain. His tier 2 is pretty bad. It's curious in that it gives him guaranteed dodge, because not a lot of combat characters have that. It's kind of a speed thing to get. But Crossbones struggles mightily in basically every game mode. He's only useful in Alliance Battle because he's a combat villain who gives you physical attack. So if you're trying to score higher in that day and you don't have Hulk's uniform or Ulik, then this is a viable option, but as a tier 2, he's irrelevant. Moving on to Ulik. Ulik is the other supervillain combat who has a physical leadership, so he is useful for that for Alliance Battle. His passive is pretty strong, but just given his kit and given that we have a lot of good combat characters, he's nothing more than situationally useful. He is pretty useful in Shadowlands, but other than that, and other than the Alliance Battle mentioned for the leadership to boost either Nebula or Carnage as your main damage dealing combat supervillain, he's nothing more than situationally useful. Next up, we have Red Hulk. Now, Red Hulk is one of the heroes that does gain a lot from his tier 2 passive. 30% is a big decrease, and the bonus damage is fantastic, and the extra heal on absorb radiation is great. However, if you combine it with his uniform, he becomes an absolutely insanely hard character to kill. He's a monster. So I will mention that without his uniform, I think that his tier 2 is just situationally useful. But with his uniform, this is definitely a strongly recommended tier 2. So if you have Red Hulk's uniform, you should consider building him up to a tier 2 character because he becomes nigh unkillable. And especially given the fact that his leadership boosts his damage by an insane 60%, it's super value to tier 2 him with the uniform. Next up, we have Volstagg, and Volstagg's tier 2 is kind of sad, although it does apply to all team members. 20% is just not enough. We didn't see any kind of Odin Volstagg meta appear because with Volstagg's tier 2, Odin would have a whopping 50% all damage reduction. Sadly, we didn't see that, so I can't really recommend his tier 2. It's probably situationally useful at best. Maybe when he gets a Warriors 3 uniform, we can revisit this ranking. Next up, we have Gorgon. So many guys who basically do the same thing. Gorgon is very good for his leadership. 45% is fantastic. He's the only character in the game who has that, but he's basically just a leadership hoe. His skills are just nothing special. He's got some curious effects on his Warcry, and he's got some CC effects, but other than that, his tier 2 really doesn't boost him all that much because there isn't much to boost. You know, he's got hooves for a reason, guys. He's here to run. He's here to pull us. He's a situationally useful tier 2 for his leadership. Next up, we have Dr. Octopus, and this is another character that really benefits a lot from having his uniform. Now, I know a lot of people will sing his praises at tier 2 with his classic outfit because it is pretty strong, 30% dodge ignore, and a pretty sizable damage buff, but actually with his uniform and his tier 2 passive, he gains a huge bonus from that because it does increase 2 seconds on the duration of his web attacks. So I would say that without the uniform, this is a situationally useful tier 2. However, with the uniform, this is a highly situationally useful, borderline recommended tier 2 combat hero. Next up, we have Kingpin. Now, Kingpin does become Blast class with his uniform, but you don't need his uniform to be successful with this character. However, given his tier 2 passive, he's not all that successful anymore. He used to be very good against world boss, but there are so many better options nowadays that despite the fact that he has very strong summons and they take a lot of aggro, he doesn't do anything else well, and he's kind of just struggled to keep up. I think this is a situationally useful tier 2 at best. Next up, we have Black Panther, one of my new favorite characters. His uniform is not actually needed, and he's actually an extremely strong character at tier 1 because of Unseen Predator. Now, his royal immunity is quite strong, 15% damage reduction, 10% all speed, and a damage bump. But I think this is just situationally useful just because Black Panther is so strong at tier 1. You could argue that this is a recommended tier 2, it's in that second category, just because of how powerful Black Panther is nowadays with all of his iframes and his immunity and his accumulated damage buff. However, he's kind of suffering from the same syndrome that Sharon Rogers suffers from. He's already very strong at tier 1. You're not getting as much value from another tier 2 as you are from this one. Next up, we have Nebula. Nebula is probably the strongest combat supervillain outside of Carnage if you don't have any money to spend on the game. So it does make her tier 2 either situationally useful or a strong recommendation depending on who you are as a player. If you spend money, this is situationally useful at best. If you don't spend money, this might be your go-to combat tier 2. If you do tier 2 her, you absolutely need her uniform. It does have an additional effect there, and I believe it also has an iframe, and it is quite easy to scale her damage up in Shadowlands when you get access to characters like Lincoln Campbell. But for World Boss, and especially for Combat Supervillain Day, she does become a recommended tier 2. Just keep in mind what you need as a player. Next up, we have Blade, and I can't wait for his Wesley Snipes uniform because his 70s classic looks cool but doesn't really do much as far as the skills go, and his tier 2 passive is just kind of woeful, guys. 30% dodge ignore is okay. 40 and 25% are big numbers, but it just doesn't mask the fact that this character needs a lot of help. Even with the bump to his leadership, he's still struggling. This is an irrelevant tier 2. Next up, we have White Tiger, and she's a very strong character at tier 1, especially for Shadowlands, being a combat hero, being a female, and being one with the 5 seconds of immunity. Her tier 2 is pretty strong, but it just doesn't elevate the character to any higher levels, so at best, right now, this is situationally useful. Captain America is another character who desperately needs a uniform. While his tier 2 passive is strong, his uniform bonus, especially with the latest Marvel Now, is very strong, and it will make his tier 2 passive a lot more beneficial. I think without a uniform, this is probably an irrelevant tier 2, but with a uniform, this does become highly situationally useful, and he becomes especially tanky for Shadowlands Rumbles. It's not going to make him much better against World Boss, it's not going to make him a figure in PvP or Alliance Battle, but it does make him useful in some game modes. Next up, we have Deathlock, who does get a change to Blast with his uniform that gives him a lot of flexibility for Shadowlands, and that's where I would say that he does have some value as a tier 2. His tier 2 is pretty strong and pretty unique in that he does get increased damage 50%, I think that's the highest in the game, and he gets a guard whenever he uses any of his skills. So I think with his tier 2 and with his uniform, this is a highly situational pick, borderline recommended, especially for new players who aren't very good at the game. Without the uniform and lacking the flexibility in Shadowlands, this is probably a low-level situationally useful tier 2. She-Hulk is another character who gets a pretty good chunk of, boosts from her tier 2, but just doesn't do enough. She's just used basically for her leadership. It's really not important to level her up as far as tier 2ing goes. I would say this is situationally useful at best. She doesn't really do anything special. Hulk, on the other hand, got a massive upgrade with his recent rebalancing, and Gamma Overload is now a tier 2 to be feared. With his uniform, he does become a supervillain, so that's very important for the Carnage Combat Supervillain Day if you need that leadership. However, I don't think his tier 2 is anything more than situationally useful. I think with the right gear and the right setup, you could make an argument for strongly recommended, but you need to show him a lot of love with a very good ISO set and a very good obelisk. He doesn't have as much healing as Red Hulk because he's missing the heal on the uniform, and he doesn't have a 60% damage buff the way that Red Hulk does with the fire damage. He only has 30%. As well, he doesn't have an immunity triggerable on any of his skills like Red Hulk. So if we're going to compare Red Hulk to Hulk, that's why I think the Green Giant is situationally useful and the Red Giant is a strong recommendation. Venom, on the other hand, sadly needs a buff. This tier 2 is pretty bad, even with 52%. I just corrected myself, guys. 50 is not the highest, it's now 52. Even with these crazy numbers, 45% ignore dodge, Venom still sucks, and he sucks because his skills suck. The animations are long, the animations are bad, the damage numbers are bad. The CC is the only redeeming quality. This is an irrelevant tier 2. Venom needs a lot of help. Come on, Netmarble. Next up, we have Punisher, who recently got a very strong uniform as far as changing his skills, but still sucks in that his tier 2 passive is kind of a joke. 15% defense penetration and 35% ignore dodge is just not enough. He needs survivability and he needs damage output, big time. So I think that Punisher right now is still an irrelevant tier 2, and I'm kind of sad about that. John Bernthal, thoughts? Next up, Shang-Chi, the Fist Master himself. Pretty good tier 2 passive. He gets a damage buff, okay, and it increases his Chi Reflect, which gives him a guard. That is quite good. However, I would say that Shang-Chi is only a situationally useful combat superhero because there are stronger characters in this category and he is lacking a uniform to give him additional flexibility. Hogan, who I mistakenly took Gorgon for recently, is kind of an irrelevant tier 2. Now I know he has a summon, now I know he has some pretty cool looking skills with cool effects, and he does have a pretty strong tier 2 passive in that it gives him a damage buff. However, this damage buff is when he's attacking, and it accumulates the true damage dealt, but it doesn't address the survivability issue. Hogan has no way of protecting himself, and his leadership is strong, but this is kind of just irrelevant. He's kind of just treading water with this tier 2 passive. I wouldn't recommend to tier 2 Hogan. Next up, we have Giant Man, and I think I'm in the same place about Hogan as I am for Giant Man. He does have an immunity on Giant Jackhammer. He does have the Crashing Footfalls and the Growing Pains, which are great skills, and he does have a uniform. His tier 2 passive is not bad, you know, all damage reduced by 15% for 20 seconds, increased damage for 20 seconds, but the character just doesn't shine anywhere. So I think this is either irrelevant. I would personally say irrelevant, but you could argue for situationally useful. Don't tier 2 Giant Man. There are definitely better options in a very crowded combat class. Sif, on the other hand, absolutely needs her uniform. Her uniform changes all 5 of her skills, which is insane. It's really a facelift makeover. With her recent buff to attack edge, she's a pretty decent tier 2, and 30% across the board is strong. I would say this is a highly situational tier 2. If you really like Sif, this might be a good investment for you. Bullseye, on the other hand, I don't think is a good investment despite all of the text on his tier 2 passive. Increased damage, increased speed, and chance to pierce with all damage immune is good, but Bullseye suffers from the fact that he really only has one good skill, which is Madness Knife. His other skills kinda suck. Low damage, long animations, bad targeting. This is kind of an irrelevant tier 2. You could make an argument for something else. Another one who's a bit irrelevant at this point, Jessica Jones. Even though she got a buff to some of her skill animations, even though she got a tier 2, this is just bad. 8% all speed is not helping anybody, 20% is not helping her deal more damage, and 70% of physical damage, Luke Cage doesn't even reflect enough at 100%. This is irrelevant, girl. I'm sorry. Amadeus Cho's tier 2 is another one that benefits greatly from his uniform. Without his uniform, he's not as good because with his uniform, Gamma Explosion is insane, guys. 35% damage decreased that's incoming, coupled with his native guaranteed dodge, is fantastic for his survivability. So I think he's a highly situational tier 2 with his uniform. I think he's borderline irrelevant without his uniform. So you do have to take that into consideration. Either way though, he's not a recommended Hulk tier 2. Drax, like a lot of the others, is irrelevant. His tier 2 passive looks good on paper, but it's bad. Cry for Blood doesn't do any damage or does very little damage. All of Drax's other skills do very little damage. Even with his uniform and the ignore dodge or ignore defense, it's still not enough. This is irrelevant. I'm sorry, bro. Last up for my still tier 1s, we have Hulkbuster. Hulkbuster's tier 2 got a little bit of flack because it changes his heavy duty exoframe from being physical damage immune to all damage immune, and it changes the amount of time that it's immune for. So it's a bit strange. I would say that this is a situationally useful tier 2 at best. It does improve his stats by a lot, and it does give him more cover on his 4-star passive, but it doesn't take the character to the next level. Now, as far as my tier 2s go, I have a lot of experience with these characters, so I am very confident in my ranking for them as follows. I think that Luke Cage, despite how cool his tier 2 passive looks, is just situationally useful. If you want something cute to do on some of the physical days, which doesn't work against Black Dwarf, by the way, if you want to really invest in Luke Cage and have a really strong Shadowlands character, go ahead. I think this is situationally useful. I don't think there is a lot of argument to say that he is a strong recommendation for tier 2, but I have fun with him. Kamala Khan, on the other hand, is a strongly recommended tier 2. She gets a bonus increase to her damage and bonus damage, but she also gets a bonus increase to accelerated healing. With her tier 2, it now increases her heal to 30%, which is Moon Knight level. So she's basically Moon Knight minus some of the iframes. She definitely gets a big bump in her survivability as well from her uniform. However, that does change her typing to speed, which is good. It gives her more flexibility for Shadowlands, but keep that in mind because it won't allow you to use her as a physical combat character. But I'd still say strongly recommended. Warwolf, on the other hand, you know, a month ago before Phil Coulson, I would say that this is a strongly recommended tier 2 because of the utility in the no restriction and combat hero alliance battle days. However, now that he's only useful in one day, he's only useful for Moon Knight's combat hero, I would say that this is a highly situationally useful uniform. Very good for alliance battle, very good for making other people look good in World Boss and Shadowlands, and that's about it. This should not be high on your priority list if you're building up new combat heroes, because he's not very good on his own. He's absolutely support only. Next up, we have Iron Fist, and Iron Fist is a character who very recently got a huge jump in his output from his uniform, his most recent Iron Fist uniform. If you have this one, he is absolutely a beast. He is a strong recommendation for tier 2, no questions asked. With any of his other uniforms, I would say at best he's situationally useful because the new uniform just adds so much to his kit. But taking a look at his tier 2 passive, it's actually quite strong. 35% is no joke. It makes him quite tanky and quite survivable, especially coupled with his uniform's passive. And the 35% crit increase is very good for letting off massive attacks, especially with the Iron Fist. Coupled with his uniform, he's high level, very, very strong. Just under Moon Knight, I would say. Without the uniform, however, this is probably something that you should be cautious about because you're not going to get as much value out of it given any of the other options besides this new uniform. Next up, second on my list, number 2, Moon Knight, guys. Moon Knight gets a whopping 30% heal when he's below 30% from his tier 2. So he gets the same thing as Kamala Khan. The thing that makes Moon Knight especially powerful with his uniform is the iframes, guys. He's got iframes on his 2nd skill, his 3rd skill, and his 5th skill. His leadership is crap, but he is right now the #1 top dog for combat superheroes. He does insane damage, especially with the right setup, and his iframes make it very easy to stay out of harm's way for the entire fight. You can solo basically any Shadowland stage, any world boss, high scores in alliance battle. He is the #1 combat hero right now, and only Iron Fist is threatening to dethrone him. Last up on the list, the one you don't want to hear about, the PAYWALL, Carnage. He's PAYWALL for a reason, guys. Despite not having a uniform, he is insane. Crazy damage on Insanity Strike, crazy buffs on his tier 2 passive, 6 seconds of invincibility. Carnage is arguably the strongest combat character from tier 1 to tier 2. his tier 1 character is really nothing special. He's very run-of-the-mill average as a combat supervillain. However, when you tier 2 Carnage, he becomes Carnage. He actually gains so much value from his tier 2, it's crazy. So I have to put him number 1. He's unequivocally, no doubt, the number 1 supervillain for combat. He's one of the best supervillains in the game, period. So he had to be at the top of this list, guys. Lastly, I will go and talk about Green Goblin because I wasn't able to talk about him for the speed day, so I will quickly discuss what I think of the character. I think that Green Goblin is an interesting character because of his iframes and because you can scale his damage really well with poison obelisks. His tier 2 passive is actually quite good. 45% is a lot and 30% is great. So this is even better than Black Widow's tier 2, Nebula's tier 2. It's very, very strong. His uniform does give him basically the same tier 2 passive, except you need to change out the poison damage for fire, and then instead of increased guaranteed dodge, he has all defense 15%. I would say that I think the guaranteed dodge is better, but this is pretty good, and 35% does help him gain back some of the damage that he loses from these skill changes with his uniform. I would, however, say that Green Goblin is probably highly situationally useful at best. If you really like the character, you should invest in him because I think he's strong enough as a standalone character, but he's not enough to get a strong recommendation at this point. So let me know what your thoughts are on the new setup for the best tier 2 list, guys. Let me know who you think is the best combat tier 2. I know there's going to be a lot of arguing about Moon Knight and Iron Fist. Come at me, bros. And of course, if you like what you see, I hope to see you again tomorrow. Take care.